ADA 30 Idaho Interview Series. Mark Johnson, interviewed by Mark Leeper.
Hello, I'm Mark Leeper with the Northwest ADA Center, Idaho, and Disability Action Center Northwest, and pleased to do another one of our recordings of folks that have been notable in the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act and continue to be involved in disability rights. And so it's my distinct pleasure to introduce to you all Mr. Mark Johnson. That I believe the first time I ever saw you was back in about a 1986 nickel conference where I believe the Department of Transportation had some brass up on a dais where they were talking to us, and a young man in the audience kind of took them on. And that's my recollection. I don't know whether you remember that or not.
There's a few foggy memories of that. But that was about, I used to come to nickel conferences and and if I knew there were going to be certain people who had been avoiding us, making appointments or answering phone calls, you just showed up where they were, took them on where they were.
Well, that was once you got into advocacy. Now you started out. You're from Georgia, and in fact, you just retired from the Shepherd Center. Is that right?
Yeah, I got started in the '70s when I was in North Carolina. Actually worked with some folks to start one of the first one of the first Title VII funded independent living centers. There were initially 10 grants in the late '70s, and we started a center there in Charlotte, North Carolina. It's gone through name changes and leadership changes, like most centers, but that's when I got my start. And actually a little before that, my start was right when I was getting out of college, started the Metrolina chapter of the National Paraplegia Foundation. It was a support group for people with paralysis, primarily people with spinal injuries. And then we became the fiscal sponsor for that center. And then that was kind of the path that got me where I am now.
And then you moved out to Colorado.
Got married.
Yeah.
In '81, and my wife Susan was already out there in Colorado, and I went out there and tried to find a job and wound up at a center that no longer exists. You probably remember, it's called HALE.
Oh yeah.
Holistic Approaches to Independent Living.
Yeah, you bet I do.
It was one of the few towns, you remember, Denver, that had 3 independent living centers. Atlantis Community, which still exists, HALE, which went away, and there was actually at that time a center on deafness. I don't know if it's still there or not, but all 3 of those entities got some federal money back in those days.
I'll be darned. Yeah, there's kind of some strange things if you track down in some of the center funding and the way it all worked, and Idaho certainly has its share. So you were in Colorado, and so you kind of met some folks that people may have heard about. You were, of course, before the Americans with Disabilities Act. The initial battle was to try to get regulations for Section 504. And you got specifically involved in transportation stuff. And a fellow by the name of Wade Blank?
Yeah, well, there was a guy, Wade Blank had started Atlantis, and a guy named Barry Rosenberg. They were colleagues, Wade and Barry. Barry was a little more moderate, especially as far as direct action. And so Barry had started HALE, and my first job out there in Colorado actually was running a transitional living program, meaning where people coming out of institutions or coming out of their own homes would move in for a while, learn what it's like, and then we'd transition them again. And of course, probably my happiest moment was when we closed down the transitional program, because we said, why are we transitioning people twice? Let's just find a place, bring the services to people until they can figure out what kind of support they need. And so I worked at HALE, became the director of advocacy there. And then I met Wade actually shortly after I moved there in '81 after my marriage. And we hooked up and he taught me a lot, became a mentor, a friend.
Mhm.
And so in 81 and 82, we did some stuff around transportation there because, as you're well aware, um, you know, Section 504 of the Rehab Act had some transportation provisions, but when Reagan got elected, the whole thing of local option got created. Republicans tend to like, state options, or states' rights. Well, you kind of question that now, don't you? Sometimes you go, oh, now states are trying to do their own thing, and now the Republicans are telling them they got to listen to it from the top. So what's interesting about it was Reagan came in, local option. There was a lawsuit, APTA versus Lewis, meaning the American Public Transit Association, versus against Secretary Lewis at that time. And ultimately that kind of eroded the 504 mandate, and every transportation system out there was stepping back from their commitment to list on new buses. And Denver was proceeding forward, other cities, Oregon, I think it was Portland maybe, I know Seattle, some of the Bay Area, some other larger systems were still going in the right direction. But, in general, we'd lost the federal mandate. The federal mandate had been eroded and something needed to be done. And so that's when Wade and I and a handful of other people got in the back room and said, well, we've won the issue here in Denver. Maybe we need to start something nationally.
So that became the
Impetus for ADAPT, meaning
Americans.
it's funny. America, well, at that time it's called American Disabled for
Yep.
Accessible Public Transit.
Right.
It became the American Disabled for Attendant Programs today, and now it's just easier to say ADAPT, and it's much easier for a reporter to remember it too, by the way.
Well, yeah, there's something to be said for having a little shorter thing to write too. That's for sure.
Well, Bob Kafka in Austin,
Mhm.
Texas.
Mm-hmm.
Bob said, well, if we ran out of things to do with that name, we could always become American Disabled for Accessible Public Toilets. And we could go in and when non-disabled people are using accessible toilet stalls, we block them in.
There you go.
Yeah.
That fit right in with some of Ron Mace's ideas of having a high toilet that would automatically go up and down according to the need too. So
Universal design.
that's right. Good stuff. Now, another memory I have of you, Mark, was in Spokane in 1995. And I think what impressed me the most early on, it became pretty clear to a lot of us that some pretty heavy duty advocacy was required to make some gains in areas we needed to make gains in. And I remember, I think you were up there and at an IL conference, and about 8:30 in the morning, I heard this cheering and screaming coming from a workshop. And I thought, my God, who the heck could be getting people that fired up that early in the morning? And of course, I suppose if you came over from the East Coast, it wasn't quite so early for you, but I was impressed at that time, that commitment to advocacy. Can you talk about just how building that advocacy network, and then of course some ideas that came out of Spokane?
Yeah, I think, all of us go through this process. I don't mean just people with disabilities, but in general, what do we believe? What are we willing to do about it? And my upbringing was not necessarily, activism upbringing. I mean, my parents did some activist stuff back in the civil rights movement. They left a couple churches because of things that were said or done. When I was in college at age 19, before my injury, I ran across a rally down in the campus. It was the first Earth Day. If you think about Earth Day, is 50 plus years old now, right? So I didn't really have a big activist background. And then when I got injured around the age of 20 and ultimately went back to college and began to have experiences that didn't feel good, where people were treating me differently. And at that time, I didn't really categorize them as discrimination. I might say, well, it's lack of awareness or ignorance or whatever. And then I began to understand, no, the status quo benefited people. Some people wanted things to stay the same so they could stay in charge. And so gradually, when we started the support group, that Metro Atlanta chapter of the National Paraplegia Foundation, we began to have conversations about why don't we have building codes that, mandate access? Why don't we get some of these public policies changed so people aren't so isolated, so people will have the level of support they need? Well, why don't we have civil rights? You can go back to 1968 and the Architectural Barriers Act, and that was kind of a beginning of saying, hey, if you get this kind of money, you got to do these things. And as you alluded to earlier, Section 504, if you get federal funds, and you got to do these kinds of things. But we didn't have this kind of mandate. And so through people like Wade and through some of the experiences I've had in independent living or with other adapters, my sense of righteousness kind of grew. And I began to kind of go, well, it's pretty clear that we need a civil rights law for people with disabilities. And to handle these things like building codes and access to public transit, or to prevent people from saying, hey, we don't have to hire your kind, or. So it was a process, is what I'm trying to say, is, didn't have a whole lot of opportunities or education about, social change for 20 years of my life. But then when I began to experience things and it became personal, and then I wanted to take it personally, that's when it kind of started kicking. And then I just realized, well-intended people are well-intended people, but they don't always do good things. And so therefore, we're the experts. So if something's going to get done, we have to do something.
And a lot of folks are glad you did. So fast forward, Americans with Disabilities Act passed and came along, and admittedly, some of it was pretty slow going and kind of required a lot of work to let people know what was happening. And so out of that Spokane workshop or conference, you came up with an idea, and then that I think ultimately led to the Spirit of the ADA torch relay. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think, we had, as you said, the process. In fact, you got it over your left shoulder and right behind your head, the signing of ADA, and off your left shoulder, there's the infamous crawl, Capitol crawl. But it took a lot of people doing a lot of different things. In fact, that one off your right shoulder is Justin Dart at a rally. A lot of people forget, when they only talk about the crawl, they forget there was a march going to the U.S. Capitol, and they forget there was a rally right before the crawl, and then they forget that the next day 150 people took over the U.S. Capitol, 104 people got arrested. So as you well, long history, a lot of people doing a lot of stuff, came together and got the law passed in 1990. And so when I was out there in Washington and whatnot, my brain, as you can tell, goes fast sometimes. And nobody was really thinking about, or at least I couldn't find anybody thinking about the 10th anniversary of ADA years ahead before it was, if you think about it, the 10th anniversary was 20 years ago. It was year 2000. And anything big nationally where you want to engage as many people that want to engage, you got to start thinking about it. Now, why don't we have an anniversary? Or why don't we take something like, a torch around the country? And so I think if I remember, someone challenged me there, meaning, well, then go ahead. Let's do some kind of relay. And so for a couple of years, a guy named Paul Timmons, who now lives in Charleston, who started a group called Portlight Strategies, does a lot of disaster relief specific for the disabled community, or the disability community. He and I tried to raise some money and created this concept of 24 cities in 2 months. We'd light the torch off King's Tomb. We'd take that lit torch to Houston to get Bush Sr. to be part of a ceremony. And then we get it out to California and we bring it all the way across the country, and not just end in DC, actually end at the United Nations. And so through a series of events, I give Becky Ogle a significant amount of credit. Paul and I were in debt, and Becky Ogle gave me a call one day and said, if you can be in DC next week to pitch Volkswagen of America, because Volkswagen of America at that time was rolling out its accessible Eurovan.
Right.
And they needed some way to bring attention to what they were doing in the way of an adapted van. And I said, I'll be there. And I pitched them. And that afternoon, they pledged $500,000 to fund. Well, then I turned around and said, Paul and I never really wanted to be the face of this thing. And we went to AAPD, the American Association of People with Disabilities. You know, John Kemp, and Paul Hearn. We had pitched him a couple of years later, and they just weren't ready to think that big and put their arms around something like that. We said, well, you know, every year we wait is one less detail we can plan. But in the meantime, we had picked cities for purposes. You know, Denver, obviously, because of its history, and the Bay Area because of its history. We, you know, Topeka, Brown versus Board of Education, separate's not equal. We picked, we went across the Pettus Bridge. You know, that's gotten a lot more visibility recently because of the connection. And so we went by the Ebenezer Baptist Church. You know, we picked all these human and civil rights and disability rights historical sites. Little White House in Georgia, where FDR went, you know. So we picked all those locations. We had all these ideas. We had no money. We got the money from Volkswagen. We went back to AAPD. At that time, they were bringing Andy Imparato on board and said, hey, would you like this thing now? This is a way for you to build them to build Volkswagen to do their thing around their Eurovan. This is a way to build, you know, the AAPD brand or audience. And they agreed. So they paid off our debt. They kept Paul and I on as kind of consultants for and I ran into a guy in Georgia, a guy named DJ Makovitz, who is, his expertise is large events. I'm talking about like sporting events, all the logistical stuff. And I called him up and said, listen, unfortunately, we didn't have a lot of time. And we're talking about, at that time, it was like probably 6 or more months before. And we contracted him, and he put together his team and some, at that time, what was that program? The federal program that funded young folks to,
Vista.
It was like a Vista thing.
Yeah.
Grabbed a couple students, and the next thing you know, they hit the road. 24 days, 24 cities in 2 months. Came through DC, went to the FDR Memorial where both the Clintons showed up, and then ended the Spirit AD torch relay at the United Nations, because what we wanted to say was, this is not just about Atlanta or Georgia or US, this is an international movement. And so it was a great event. There's still a lot of pictures floating around out there. There's some stories floating around out there. Unfortunately, the website that was created that documented why we went to each city, and what we did in each city, and who we did it with, and all that kind of stuff. The woman who was behind it passed away, and I called her family, and they said, well, we're going to keep it up live. And unfortunately, about 2 years later, it disappeared. So there's a little bit of content out there. Unfortunately, not as much as would have been nice. And I think that's what we've learned since, and that was the focus of the 25th anniversary was, you know, the ADA Legacy Project, and making sure things like behind you don't just exist, but they're put in a format where more of the public can see it. So that's how I got involved in that. And it all came out of that person pushing back on me there at that conference saying, well, just do it. Think, great idea, just do it. So I actually want to give whoever that was some credit too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you mentioned the ADA Legacy Project, and so you were really, really active in that. And of course, Tom Olin was as well, and that was really successful. And so now we're up at 30 years. Um, what do you think? Got a
Well,
lot still to do, or?
yeah, I think, obviously I was the director of advocacy at a place called Shepherd's in Atlanta, a rehab hospital, and I've been involved with ADAPT and concrete change and Not Dead Yet. Just a lot of folks doing a lot of good work over the years, and blessed to have learned from people. And I keep learning. And the Legacy Project was an important celebration, like you said, with Tom, with the bus going around the country for a year, and doing things with the Smithsonian and the Kennedy Center and whatnot. But when a couple years ago, when someone came up to me and said, "Well, are you going to be involved in ADA 30?" And I said, "I really don't think I need to be. I mean, I'm happy to answer questions about what we learned from the 10th and the 25th, and how you can kind of, create a brand, and how you can create a message, and how you can create a look." And nobody really bit a couple years ago. I think our community still lacks the ability to think big and do big things. I mean, they're in Idaho and whatnot. You've done some great stuff around people in that region, actually. But in Idaho, I know they've done a lot of great things around anniversaries. And we still seem to have some reluctance to connect with other states and do something national. And so nothing really was happening, 2 years ago or even last year for ADA 30. And I think, to me, there were things planning, don't get me wrong, cities and states.
Sure.
And then all of a sudden, Crip Camp goes to Sundance. And then all of a sudden, Crip Camp starts showing on Netflix. And Kelly Buckland, who you know, with the National Council of Independent Living, actually since late last fall, was hosting monthly conversations about ADA 25. Just, hey, where are we? Anybody know what's going on? People want to do some things together. And gradually, slowly, people started coming together. And I know Maria Town with AAPD, American Association of People with Disabilities, again, created a portal for ADA 30 activities. And then we had COVID, and a lot of things turned virtual. So here were these things that were local events that also became international events. If you create a Crip Camp on a Sunday, or if you create a ADA 30 in color event by Alice Wong and some of her colleagues, all of a sudden you could participate anywhere in the world in those things. And so I think in some ways it was kind of neat, because one of the things some of us talked about at the end of last year on those calls that Kelly was holding was, okay, maybe it's not a torch, and maybe it's not a bus, maybe it's a communications plan. And so I think when it's all said and done and the dust settles, and hopefully a couple professors and a couple really energetic interns, I think we'll look at the fact that ADA 30 has probably been covered better in mainstream and alternative media than any anniversary. I've seen that. And what's interesting is some of the content produced for those platforms has been produced by disabled people. I mean, you look at what that series the New York Times did. Our folks wrote a lot of that. Granted, the New York Times still needs to learn we actually have some disabled people that are good editors too, But my point is, I think, once again, get through this election, I encourage somebody to take that and gather that up and not let that stuff get lost, because it kind of leads into what you asked me 10 minutes ago before I started going off on this process. It says a lot about what's next. And it's not the simple narrative of better enforcement and more funding. It talks about really the role of Black disabled people and people of color. And it talks, in fact, there are a number of events organized by Black disabled leaders this year. Not that some of them weren't involved in the past, but they were front and center this year. And I just think a lot of those conversations, some are continuing to go on about what's next, show up in a lot of that coverage. And it's really, it's stuff that's much more profound and deeper than I used to think. You know, I was just trying to find an accessible parking place, get on a sidewalk, get in the building,
Right.
you know, get under the McDonald's table because they were all at one time, you know, permanent units and the seats were all attached. And if you were in a wheelchair, you couldn't even sit at a McDonald's,
Right.
you know, fast food restaurant table. So I just think that the stuff is there. Yeah, you can talk about, okay, we still significant unemployment. You know, we can still talk about clearly the institutional bias in long-term services and support. I mean, just look at what's happened in congregate facilities where people have significant infection rate, death rate, because we continue to force people to live together when we know they can live in the community with the right support. So, you know, the employment issue or economic justice issue or the institutional bias, you know, from a policy standpoint, I mean, right now, there's a debate, negotiation going on, right, for a COVID relief package. And for all intents and purposes, it's probably the last chance where our community can get some dedicated home community-based service money. I'm not feeling real optimistic. You know, I'm not sure what that says. I'm an optimistic person, don't get me wrong. But, you know, we were not included in previous packages. And I just don't know whether dedicated money is going to be there. Now, they call it FMAP, or, you know, it's a federal match incentive. Okay, but hospitals and congregate nursing home type facilities have been grabbing that money up, you know, when it gets down to home community service. So still a long ways to go, but I really think the answer to what's next, you know, is in a lot of those conversations that have been recorded and in a lot of those op-eds that have been written by folks from our community and a much more diverse group of people writing those op-eds.
So maybe the next step is kind of bringing more of those people together, and with some of that advocacy energy that we get from the history as well, and move it on forward.
Yeah, I think, and also and challenge ourselves to, you know, if you look at our structures, you know, if you look at whether it's AAPD or nickel or I could go down the long list of organizations.
Sure.
Look at how you're structured and look at whether there's different ways to organize, because there clearly are. You know, I mean, you look at what Alice Wong has done with the Disability Visibility Project, and her and Andrew and Greg have done with Crypt the Vote. That's not a big budget in a building with a bunch of paid staff, you know, and there are just endless number of examples of that kind of organizing that is less hierarchical, you know, much more efficient. You know, just really, I mean, the disability, there's a book out, you know, Disability Visibility, edited by Alice Wong. But I'd encourage people to take a look at the 8830 in color list of essays that are on that website, and read those essays, because those are essays from some young folks, well, current leaders and emerging leaders, and pay attention to what they're saying, because it may make your hair stand up, and you may even feel threatened. But we got some really smart people, and I just think we all come together here intergenerationally and intersectionally and all that. We can change some of the reality that some people are living right now.
And that's the ADA 30 in color website?
ADA 30 in color. It's going to come up under disability visibility. I'll actually forward it to you, Mark.
All right.
But
We'll
it's
share it out to folks.
a good series of essays to read about what is that, 25 to 40 crowd thinking.
Yeah.
And what do they see as next? And what would they like to see as next? And that's what I like about the younger folks is, some people, I think Rebecca Coakley coined the term ADA generation. Who are those folks that when they were born, there was already Architectural Barriers Act or 504 or right to education or ADA, all those things were in place. And so as they come into, as they get older and begin to become part of the solution, their expectations, rightfully so, are much higher than mine in the 70s were, or 80s, right, or even 90s. And it's a healthy high expectation, because then you begin to talk about poor people are poor people, regardless of what their difference is. And we have to address things like affordable, accessible, integrated housing. We have to address like the school to prison pipeline. We have to address, police brutality and say, who are those people that are getting killed? What are some of the common denominators in addition to the color of their skin? We need to look at, and that's where some of those essays are coming from, and that's where some of the work of the ADA generation is coming from. Wicked smart, and now it's just figuring out, how do you organize, and how do you take a hashtag and turn it into, a full-fledged campaign.
Right. Challenging times, and I, like you, am impressed with a lot of the young people and the things I'm hearing, and that recognition, the true intersection of disability, is we've always talked about, crosses all boundaries. Now to have that recognition of going back and in all directions and connecting and just saying it's a human issue. It's kind of a little bit of what we tried to talk about years ago, and now with the social media and so on, it's kind of exciting stuff.
I agree. I mean, it's fun to read Judy Human's book, Being Human, Heuman. A lot of people familiar with Judy. She has done a lot of great work over the years, and she, is featured in Crip Camp, and her book came out, and interesting about how those, my generation called it paternalism. It's, people refer to it as ableism now. My generation referred to it as, working together, partnerships, collaborations. Now it's called intersectionality. I don't really care what you call it, but there truly is a coming together, and it's where those other groups, conservative or liberal or progressives or whatever, begin to realize who's not at the table here, who still needs to be at the table, who, even more, who needs to be in leadership. I mean, I know I've probably gotten in the way of some folks being at that table or in leadership roles, and I have to challenge myself to say, but I feel like I have over the last several years of be involved and be supportive, but don't get in the way. And I just think when people say, where are they? They're there. There are a lot of qualified people out there to lead us, next.
Great points, and well said. And I think you'll find a lot of people in agreement. And I'm noticing we're coming up on the danger point where I am just so enjoying chatting with you that I'd probably go on far longer than those that end up transcribing this over for publication would like me to. So any other comments you'd like to close with? And then I would just say thank you so much for your time.
Just exciting time. Be safe, and please vote in November.
great words. And be safe yourself.
Right.
It's interesting times, and it takes all of us to work together to get kind of through this thing and then continue to move forward. So thanks a lot, Mark, for your time, and we'll look forward to talking to you here soon, hopefully again anyway.
All right. Thanks a lot, Mark.
Thank you. Be
All right.
well.
Bye-bye.
Image description. A word collage in the shape of the United States with the word access highlighted and hashtag thanks to the ADA.